Hi, my name is Jamie Parker. My project explores terrorism, focusing on understanding global terror activity. My research question asks how one can explain terror activity across geographic regions. This is an empirical project. The theory is that countries with more stringent terror management policies see a negative reaction by experiencing more terror activity. This is an explanatory project where we seek to understand why this outcome is the way it is, and the methods we'll be utilizing include both qualitative and quantitative methods. To begin with my literature review, I started looking at various sources of data on terrorism statistics. So I found a great comparison of terror management and terror outcomes from Randall that was very helpful, and it really describes how Sweden has a very high rate of terror activity despite having strict terror management policies in place. Landau in 2004 found a connection between terror and individual social relationships and focused on how terror can impact relationships. Mansour in 2018 brought us information on how a variety of countries tweet about terrorism and how it impacts their daily lives, including their feelings on death and dying related to terrorism. So that leads us into the second segment of research, which focuses on terror activities, including the types, targets, and timelines. Shafiq and Seno really kind of pick up where Mansour left off and tie their research on 6 primarily Muslim countries in with that data very well. And we can cross-reference their research with Mansour's research to really get a comprehensive understanding of the impact of terrorism on social media activity. Lister and Otero Iglesias in 2012 continued this work by comparing similar types of terrorism across geographic regions. The third and final portion of exploratory research focuses on the economic consequences of terrorism, and by continuing the exploration of the countries covered in the first 2 sections, we can determine if there are patterns to be uncovered. Okal and Yildirim focused on terrorism and economic growth or destruction across geography. It leads us to the question of if terrorism causes poverty or if poverty causes terrorism. Shin doesn't focus entirely on the link between poverty and terrorism, but identifies a link that posits the theory that reducing poverty would reduce terrorism. So we can come to an intersection where these 3 categories meet that would give us a really unique understanding of how terrorism, terror management, and the economic ramifications of these things intersect in order to create this climate. My theory is that terror management practices have an impact on terror outcomes and are dependent in part on financial and educational conditions in the region. Why? So terror management practices that stifle the immigration process, which leads to undocumented immigration occurring, or create racial or religious tension, or otherwise create a tense atmosphere for residents, are likely to incite additional terror activities. Further, terror activity is reactive to financial and educational conditions. Hypothesis 1 says that the stricter a country's terror management practices are, the higher the rate of terrorism in that country. Why? Because increasing terror management does not diffuse the conditions that lead to terrorism, and it can cause terror cells to develop. Terror management programs don't address social concerns that predispose individuals to becoming activists. Hypothesis 2 taps into the second part of what that explanation for hypothesis 1 addresses, and says that the more generous a country's provision of educational and financial resources, the lower the rate of terrorism in that country, because it provides individuals with a means to make a legitimate living for their family and will persuade them away from illegitimate means to do so. And education is definitely a key contributor to being able to gain wealth in most regions of the world. The statistical method I'll be using is the K-Sears method, which is explained in the bullet point. The variables I will be using include how strict a country's terror management program is, where we'll measure the number of individuals incarcerated for participation in terrorist organizations by country. We will measure the rate of terrorism in a country by measuring the number of cases of confirmed terror activity in a country in a period of 1 year. We'll also measure a country's level of provision of financial and educational resources by determining the median income as interval ratio data and the median education as ordinal data attained via public access. If a country has more than 5 domestic terrorist organizations, we're going to measure that, and we're going to compare it with countries that have more than 1 but less than 5 active organizations, as well as countries that have 0. And it may be best to collect this in full interval ratio format and utilize this ordinal data once compiled. Countries with formalized immigration enforcement agencies will be measured and compared with countries that do not have formalized immigration agencies, which are ICE as we would know it here. Countries with democratic elections will be compared with countries that do not have democratic elections and potentially broken down by types of elections offered, if any. And then finally, countries with mandatory military service requirements will be measured. In the United States, we know that as the draft, and we'll measure the comparison versus countries that require selective service registration, but do not compel mandatory services unless a declared emergency arises, like the draft, and also comparing countries with only optional service. My secondary methodology will be conducted via observation because it's reliable, it provides the greatest understanding of the activity, and it's very useful for exploratory research, which is the type that we're doing here. It will be conducted in two ways. First, I will infiltrate a terror cell and participate as a member. This is an unobtrusive participant observation. It is unstructured and would require field notes to be completed as soon as possible after participation in activities. Clearly, I'm not going to be sitting around with a notebook jotting down what's being said, but we'd want to get that data down while it's fresh. And I must focus on fitting in, but not going native. I don't want to adopt the ideology of the organization. The second method would be to observe terror management meetings with government officials. This would be obtrusive observation, as they will know that I'm a researcher and what my intentions with the data are. And it can be both structured and unstructured. So I'll have opportunities to ask direct structured questions, but also will do some unstructured observation. And I'll use a judgmental sample to determine if patterns detected in the data study are affirmed, so that way we don't have to appear in every country at a terror management meeting, which would be very expensive and very time consuming. My expected findings are that the more strict terror management policies a country has, the higher the instances of terror activities in those countries. The countries with increased access to public education and have a higher median income see reduced terror activity both together and individually. The conclusion is that this would permit government inaction of policies focused on reducing terror based on real outcomes. So increasing education increases median income, which would reduce terror, and utilizing logical terror management without being too strict would also reduce terror. It gives a potential explanation for not affirming our hypothesis as well, which would include lack of public education beyond minimal years. An example would be education through grade 6 may make assessing data difficult. Some areas are not dependent on education for accumulation of wealth, and countries with historically low terror activity may maintain that low terror activity even after implementation of strict terror management policies. So there might not be a relationship in those countries with a low history. And the next steps would be to provide recommendations to government officials on policy enactment. The budget would include major expenses like salaries for the primary researcher, a research assistant, a secondary research assistant, a data analyst, a translator, and a coder with an anticipated total expenditure of $50,000. Travel expenses to countries in the pool of those being studied in the secondary method for terror cell infiltration and in the judgmental sample of government meetings would total $25,000. Materials, including research supplies, would be anticipated at $1,500, and then miscellaneous expenses for thank you gifts, postage, business lunches would be $2,500 with a total requested funding allowance of $78,000. The timeline would be from January and February for phase 1 to conduct initial research, review it, and present it, and it would satisfy the primary investigation into the variables presented in the statistical method. For March through May, we will be in phase 2 with travel for meetings with government-sponsored terror management organizations, and the data would be compiled and presented at the end of that period. June through August, phase 3 would be traveling for infiltration into terror cells. Data would be compiled and presented at that point. September and October would involve data from statistical research from phase 1 being compared and contrasted with data from phases 2 and 3. And then phase 2 and 3 would be compared and contrasted. Patterns would be detected, reliability tested, secondary theories tested to rule out or affirm. November 1st would result in a presentation of material in comprehensive form. Feedback would be collected and integrated into material recommendations. And on December 1st, recommendations are made to government officials on policy enactment. Thank you very much for your time. That concludes my presentation. I hope you enjoyed yourself.